All right, in Module 5, we're going to talk about strategies with students. So after you watch this module, we want you to understand the impact of different sensory interventions within the context of trauma-informed care, describe tips for de-escalation with children, and understand the importance of fostering resiliency in children. So before we talk about concrete strategies with students, I want to address some general tips when working with children and students. First, it is important to give students space to share their experience with a non-judgmental and supportive adult. So the student will need time and space to process through the trauma, and you can exemplify a supportive adult and listen to what they need to share. This will enable the child to trust you and feel comfortable coming to you. Second, it is important to maintain clear routines in the classroom. A clear and expected routine allows a sense of normalcy and safety. It's also important to warn children if there will be something out of the ordinary, maybe like a fire alarm, a change in lighting. This could really trigger a student who has had a trauma history. Third, it's important to remember to give the child choices because trauma often involves a loss of control. So giving the child choices can give them some control back. So an example of this might be, do you want the blue pen or the red pen to finish your homework? Or would you like to do the math homework or the English assignment first? Both of these examples are simple, but it allows the child to have a sense of control in the situation. Finally, it's important to recognize that behavioral problems can be related to trauma while others will fly under the radar. So I'll just kind of explain briefly what this means. So essentially, this means that we cannot assume that behavioral challenges are dispositional to the student, like, oh, they're a bad child, or oh, they're aggressive and they're mad all the time. We instead need to recognize that often behaviors are happening in response to trauma and chronic stress. It's also important to recognize that a lot of children with trauma history do not have behavioral challenges and that the trauma manifests in other ways. And with that being said, they fly under the radar. So as a result of trauma, children often demonstrate poor self-regulation and sensory sensitivity. So a child with poor self-regulation may show more signs of anger, non-compliance, aggressive behavior, sensory sensitivity, and emotional volatility. In addition, research has begun to demonstrate a connection between PTSD symptoms and sensory sensitivity. This may be due to memories of the trauma being stored as somatic sensations. So when the child is triggered by a sensation or an event, physiological responses that occurred during the trauma may reoccur for this child. So by using grounding and organizing sensory interventions, occupational therapists can aim to help the student feel safe and self-regulate throughout the school day so they can participate in school activities to their best of their abilities. Now, I want to preface by saying that sensory interventions are not always recommended, but they can be beneficial with specific students. Katie will talk more about this as we continue the module.
So we wanted to provide some specific examples of sensory interventions that can be helpful when working with this population. The interventions that you see on the left-hand side are grounding, organizing, and calming interventions, and these can support self-regulation and help meet the child where they're at. Some of these sensory interventions aim to help the child calm themselves and ground them. And this includes things like heavy work, noise-reducing headphones, low lights, and study carols. These also are especially helpful when working with students who are in that hyper-aroused trauma state. On the other hand, you may have heard or you might have background in also knowing about arousing and alerting sensory interventions. And these can be helpful when working with a child who is withdrawn, but for when you're working with someone with a trauma history, you want to really use these with caution because they can often be triggering or will increase that hyperarousal that is already happening because of their trauma history. So we would only use these arousing and alerting interventions if we have a really, really firm relationship and level of trust with that student, or if somebody really needs them to get their engine ready to learn. These arousing and alerting interventions include visuals like a lava lamp or a sensory bottle, things that involve a lot of vestibular input, such as swinging, running, and spinning, and then also colorful environments. Finally, we need to also remember that the environment plays a huge role in how the child is feeling and how they're able to regulate their sensory environment and their behavioral responses. So for example, a loud and noisy environment will often be overstimulating, especially for a child who has a trauma history, whereas a calm and quiet environment offers a sense of security. We will discuss environmental modifications a bit more specifically in Module 8. We also wanted to provide some specific strategies for de-escalation when students become really frustrated, agitated, or dysregulated. First of all, staying calm is really crucial and will help the child feel comfortable when talking to you and will help them feel less threatened. You can do this by using a friendly, calm tone and getting down on their eye level. You should also do your best to employ active listening and really validate the student's experience and reflect back what you're hearing so that they know that they're being heard. You can also offer positive choices and give the student options so that they don't feel powerless or like they're being forced to behave in a certain way. Maybe giving them an option to sit in a calming corner or do some jumping jacks in the hallway are some examples. You can also ask the students questions. Sometimes students may be struggling with something and you can offer a solution to that. So don't hesitate to ask and invite them to come up with solutions with you. We also think it's important to note just to choose your battles wisely. And if something doesn't need to be a big deal, we don't necessarily need to turn it into one and just kind of think about the grand scheme of things. And you can also educate other school staff about that. Um, when working on de-escalation, you can also use non-threatening body language, such as getting down on the child's level, keeping an open stance, so like not crossing your arms and making sure that your facial expressions are neutral or friendly, and then just making sure that you're not raising your voice and actually that you're speaking more quietly to them. You can also create a safe space for the child to go to. This could be in the classroom or in a therapy room or in a different room within the school. And this should be a place where the child can go and safely process their emotions and de-escalate. It's also important to limit the number of adults who are involved in the situation because having multiple adults can be really overwhelming or even triggering for children with a trauma history. So it's best to just stick to one person taking the lead. And if you need to swap out people, that's totally okay and sometimes can be helpful. It's also important to use simple, direct language and avoid placing too many demands on the student when they're in this highly escalated state. Because when children are hyper aroused, especially if they have experienced trauma, they likely will have difficulty processing auditory cues and using a lot of language or speaking more complexly may actually shut them down even more. And then finally, it's important to give the child the time they need to refocus. They may need some extra time and space before returning to academic work. And you can communicate these expectations with other team members and teachers. While we can target specific areas of challenges for students, we should also be sure to do our best to foster resiliency as we introduced in Module 2, which is really important for preventing further negative impacts of ongoing trauma and/or chronic stress. This can be done by fostering positive relationships between the student and you, other school personnel, other students, and their families. You can also provide opportunities of growth and achievement by creating ways for the student to feel successful. For example, you might implement a sticker chart as a positive way of helping the student track their own growth. And additionally, you can help students build more effective coping skills so that they can cope with adversity in the future. This concludes Module 5, which went over some strategies for implementing trauma-informed care with students. Next, in Module 6, we will go over strategies for working with families.